For this devotional, I wanted to talk a little bit about parables, and specifically I wanted to talk about how Jesus uses parables. And one of the reasons why Jesus speaks in these narratives, these stories, is because he wants to reveal information to a certain group of people and at the same time withholding that same information from another group of people. Another reason why, and this is what I want to talk about today, another reason why Jesus speaks in parables is that it causes the listener to actually have to do some work. In Mark chapter 4, Jesus tells this parable about it's called the parable of the sower. And he's teaching his disciples this, and they don't understand it. It's a parable. Jesus talks about a farmer who throws seeds on the ground. Some of the seeds fall onto a path or some soil with rocks in it, or good soil. And on the outside looking in, it's really a confusing parable. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. So the disciples, not really understanding what Jesus is talking about, they're forced to go to Jesus to ask him this question. Maybe they were sheepish because they didn't quite understand it, but hopefully I would have done the same thing. But they go to Jesus to find the interpretation of this parable. And what we find is this is what parables are meant to do for us at times. They're created, they're given as a type of barrier. And we see this in the case of the disciples. The barrier was they didn't understand what Jesus was talking about. So what they could have done was they could have just kind of go about their own business and just kind of forget about it, or maybe they would talk about it amongst themselves, which they do with other parables actually. But in this case, the disciples go to Jesus and maybe in their humility request that Jesus give them the information of what the parable actually means. And so that's what I want to talk about today. Barriers. Jesus teaches in parables at times to create a barrier between us and the knowledge that he wants us to have. And you might ask, well, why would Jesus ever create a barrier for someone that needs this information, that needs Jesus' teaching? Why would Jesus create a barrier? Well, I think one of the reasons why Jesus is okay with barriers is that is the best way often that we learn. I don't know about you, but I've spent years and years and years in school. The best teachers, the best professors that I have had were not teachers and professors who just gave me all the information that they felt it was important for me to have. But these particular professors, the good ones, would teach me how to learn myself. Because if you learn something on your own, if you have a problem in front of you and you are able to solve that problem, you learn so much more and it stays with you. There was a story I read that illustrates this point very well. It was a story about a man who needed to lose 150 pounds, and he went to his psychologist, and he was getting help, and very quickly, for health reasons, he dropped 70 pounds, and it was really a great feat. Dropping 70 pounds would be a big deal. And so he goes to his counselor, the psychologist, and he's excited, and he tells her that he's now able to wear these expensive suits that he used to wear when he was 70 pounds lighter before. And so he was wearing these suits, and he was proud of himself that he had lost all that weight. But then what his counselor told him was, you need to get rid of those suits. You need to get rid of those expensive clothes. And he was offended at first. He was like, what are you talking about? Why would I get rid of this stuff after I did all this work to finally be able to fit into it? And so he kind of dismissed the request. She didn't explain why precisely he needed to throw it away. And as the week went on, though, he started thinking about it. You know how sometimes you want to dismiss something that someone says because it just doesn't make sense, but for some reason it's like a seed that gets planted in your head, and it just starts to kind of gnaw at you or start to grow in your head. And for this gentleman, what happened was he started to come to the conclusion that, you know what? She was right. And the reason why she was right is because if he kept those suits, if he kept the expensive clothing that he had when he had lost 70 pounds, he would not have the energy, he would not have the passion to continue losing the weight. Remember what the goal was. It was 150 pounds. He had only lost 70. So he came to the conclusion, you know what, she was right. And he threw away all those clothes so that he could continue pursuing his goal. And very often, that's how God works in our lives. And maybe we struggle with that in our particular culture in America because we are so comfortable, right? We are so aware that barriers just are almost non-existent, or they shouldn't be. Or if there is a barrier in front of us in our life in whatever capacity, then there must be something wrong with us, or maybe there's something wrong with God. But the reality is God creates barriers for us so that we can more closely rely on him. A barrier very often is a blessing in disguise. We don't recognize it as a blessing because it's uncomfortable. And what do I mean by barrier? Well, it could be anything. It could be, we're not moving up in our job, right? Or maybe there are personalities in our lives, relationships that we have that are just difficult. It could really be anything, a barrier in front of us to what we believe our life should be and what it should look like. But let's not forget that God is okay with barriers. He's okay with stopping us in our tracks, and maybe sometimes for years. And maybe it's as simple as God waiting on answering a prayer. That could be a barrier as well. So what do we do in the meantime? What do we do when there's a barrier in front of us and we don't see how it's going to turn out? It kind of reminds me a little bit of when I was in high school. Before the football season started, we had these things called two-a-days, and two-a-days were basically just this, the worst part of football. Before the season started, you would have 2 practices every day. At the end of August, beginning of September, it was extremely hot, and they were miserable. And the coaches, I think, took a lot of pleasure in beating us up physically. And we hated the two-a-days, but we all knew, and the coaches especially knew, that the misery that they inflicted on us physically would come back and be a benefit to us in ways that we couldn't really calculate until the time came when we played a game. And very often we consider barriers as a God problem, or maybe an us problem, but in reality a barrier could simply mean God is preparing you for something different, something new, something that you may not have even considered before. So let's lean into those barriers. And maybe that's another way of saying that is, let's lean into God even when we are facing a barrier, whatever that could be. So with that, hopefully that's encouraging to you. Blessings. Have a good week.